Thanks, Steve, and it's my pleasure to join all of you at ARC. I've been following the work of ARC since Andy and Steve and others initiated this, so I'm very pleased to join you today from a snowy Toronto here in Canada. So Beatrice and I were asked to talk about a focus on policy and developing professionally run education systems. Now, these things, of course, come together. They absolutely need to. However, we decided that I would focus on the professionally run education systems, and Beatrice and Steve's conversation has already taken us into the topics of leadership in the education profession. And indeed, in many of your responses in the Learn Lab word clouds and questions, you've already raised some of these topics. So I'm going to talk about the people dimension of educational change, the role of leaders and of the education profession. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with an image from Charlie Maxey, who's in England, but you might be familiar with his work. And the quote here is, "Can a storm change you?" "Yes," said the horse, "often into the shape of one who holds others in a storm." And as leaders, you are holding others as we move through this global pandemic. So I want to start about thinking about your own leadership. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So if we go over to the Learn Lab platform, and we're going to do a word cloud here. So in one or two words, what have been the most important leadership practice? What have been your most important leadership practices over the past 12 months? I can see the largest words: communication, collaboration, listening, calm. So if we perhaps move on from the word cloud, I'll go a bit deeper into the leadership piece. So the first thing I want to say is thank you. We've all been through this storm of the pandemic over almost 12 months now for most of us. And I know that you are system leaders in various ways, whether in government or teacher federations or other professional associations, or in regional or district roles, or school leaders. So thank you for your leadership. We of course appreciate the frontline work that's happening, but the leadership piece is really important. And so that's where I'm going to start, about the role of leadership. If we go to the next slide, please. So if I was sitting here 12 months ago in January 2020, when we started 12 months ago, we had a substantial body of evidence around effective educational leadership and about the importance of developing a professionally run education system. So we kind of knew what effective large-scale educational change looked like. And you have been leaders and involved in that, the work of ARC, as well as many other people, Beatrice and the OECD. So I want to think about what we knew at the start of 2020 and what has or hasn't changed now that we're at the start of 2021. So if we can go to the next slide. So there had been debates about what's the role of government in large-scale educational change, the tension between top-down or bottom-up, or leading from the middle in Andy's work. But we had clear evidence that government leadership matters. Government needs to be involved in democratic education decision-making for our publicly funded education systems. However, that role needs to be largely strategic and enabling. Political leaders who value and prioritize the importance of education, that politically education matters, and that's reflected in budgetary decisions, in the communication with the media, in the work with the profession, in discussions with parents and students. And that those political leaders work with capable government officials and educators in key leadership roles who provide the educational expertise to inform strategy development in collaboration with the education sector. Senior leadership, political and professional, matters. But it also matters that the government works collaboratively with stakeholders to develop those vision and goals and priorities. And then that the government provides the enabling conditions to turn that vision into an implementable reality, strategy, policies, adequate and appropriate resources, positive and proactive communication, and then gathering system evidence to identify problems and adjust strategies as you move forward. District leadership also matters. So on the slide, I have the work of Leithwood, where Leithwood talks about the core processes of districts around the alignment and the coherence of system level policies, but also thinking about your local needs in your region or your municipality or your district, about providing the support for the core work of schools, instruction, curriculum assessment, using and gathering local evidence, supporting district improvement planning, school improvement planning, professional development for all of the staff involved, and combining local needs and contexts with overall system priorities. And of course, as Andy and colleagues have said, leading from the middle, not just a hierarchy of governance, but leading from the middle of innovation and action and local needs. If we go to the next slide, please. We also knew by 2020 that school leadership absolutely mattered. In fact, by 2020, we had more evidence about this. So I'll give you a quick run through of Leithwood, Harris and Hopkins' work, which you may be familiar with. Back in 2008, they made 7 strong claims about successful school leadership that have been extremely influential in school leadership development here in Ontario, as well as in many other contexts. They then revisited and updated those claims in 2019, published in 2020. And what they actually found was from 2008 to 2020, the evidence about the importance of school leadership was more substantial, was more compelling, was more sophisticated, and was more nuanced. So school leadership matters. It's rare in education research that you have such a strong body of evidence around something. So you're probably all familiar with a variation of the phrase that school leadership is second only to teaching in the impact for student learning. And this was one of the phrases that Leithwood, Harris and Hopkins actually revised, because what they found was more evidence about how this happens. And so in 2020, the phrase now is, school leadership has a significant effect on features of the school organisation which positively influences the quality of teaching and learning. So school leaders creating the conditions and the climate of the school and supporting teaching and learning. And here, while moderate in size, this leadership effect is vital to the success of most school improvement efforts. We don't see school improvement without effective school leadership. So that's the key. And it became clearer that leaders draw on a range of key practices: developing the organisation, developing people, clear vision and goals, linked resources, a form of instructional leadership. And what they found that in this type of instructional leadership, most school leaders, this was the key. And it varied by context. You need to adapt your context. We absolutely have learned that over the past 12 months, but the core practices remain similar. If we go to the next slide, please. So the idea of the indirect effect, that school leadership improves student learning by improving school conditions, classroom conditions, supporting teaching, particularly through professional learning and development of staff. And now also, or in 2020, thinking about school leadership engaging with parents and child interactions in the home. And again, this is something that has become absolutely key. And then 5 and 6 are about distributed leadership. So in 2008, what Leithwood, Harris and Hopkins said was that there's a lot of interest in distributed leadership. It's a popular idea. People are intrigued by it. You know, it makes sense. Let's distribute leadership. Let's involve more people in leadership. That a school principal or a head teacher can't or should not do it all on their own. But in 2008, there wasn't a huge body of evidence around that. Roll forward to 2020, there now was substantial evidence about the importance of distributed forms of leadership within schools and indeed in other contexts. However, claim 6, some patterns of distribution are more effective than others. And those that are more effective are ones that take into account the capacity and the capability of the people who leadership is being distributed to. So thinking about who are the key people in your school building or in your education system that you can draw into formal leadership positions or who have informal influence. So not simply distributing leadership, but being strategic about that process. And finally, and this came up actually in many of your words, in your word cloud responses, the idea that actually personal leadership resources matter. So this is the idea of cognitive resources, problem-solving abilities, knowledge of education, knowledge of the work that you're doing, and social and psychological resources, empathy, optimism, self-efficacy, resilience, and I would think they have become even more important now. So as well, of course, as school leadership, if we go to the next slide, teacher leadership matters. Many education systems have formal roles for teachers to be promoted or appointed into to develop a range of their leadership, curricular expertise, subject expertise, maybe particular positions. But teachers' informal leadership with their colleagues and their peers and their community matter too, in terms of sharing knowledge and skills and practices to support students. So what we see is the importance of professional judgment, expertise and experience to support improvements for students, of course, in classrooms, but when that's shared, the capacity to support improvements in schools and in some cases entire education systems. So thinking about teachers not only leading student learning, but engaging in and leading professional learning and collaboration, sharing their knowledge and skills, what I call deprivatization of practice, literally or metaphorically opening up classroom doors, sharing their practice, sharing their expertise and knowledge mobilization, thinking on ways to share that practice, sharing resources that have been developed, sharing references or lists or websites, all sorts of ways. But that is powerful. We have seen in our research the power of teachers sharing their knowledge and practices. And that has become, again, even more important over the past 12 months. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this idea of a professionally run education system, a professionally led education system, was something that we looked at in a study called Constructing Teachers' Professional Identities that was funded by Education International and overall led by Philippa Cordingley, and I was part of the team working on this. And we looked at the education profession, the work of teachers in 7 education systems: Berlin, Chile, Kenya, Ontario, Scotland, Singapore, and Sweden. Some are countries, some are cities, some are a province like Ontario. These were chosen because they're a combination of systems with higher or lower education performance, with different approaches to developing the education profession, and with different policy approaches. So we didn't take all of the PISA high performers. We took countries or education systems at different stages in development. If we go to the next slide. And one of the things that we found is that the education systems that invested in valuing and developing the education profession were those that were higher performing, and vice versa. So we made some recommendations. The importance around thinking about how you develop the teaching profession, career paths and teacher supply. Thinking about system level improvement and its impact on the education profession. When policies change, they have an impact on teachers' working lives, on how they're perceived as a profession. That there needs to be explicit policies for raising the status of the profession. It doesn't just happen. There needs to be explicit policies. Teachers' roles and values, the importance of respect for educators, and indeed in a good, healthy education system, respect for all that are involved in all levels of the education system, mutual respect. The issue of time and work-life balance is now a long-standing one, and one that has been exacerbated in recent months and years. And thinking about, when you think about new or changing policies or strategies or practices concerned with students, of course, who are the most important, but you have to think in parallel, what are the implications for the education profession? So what changes are being supported for the education profession in order to support changes for students? Next slide, please. And this is one that's come up in some of the comments already around the idea of professional autonomy, a teacher-led education system. Excuse me. Now, we were focused on teachers, but I would broaden this out to be educators, the education profession. Of course, I've already said that educators at other levels of the system matter too. Trust, something Beatrice emphasised, and teacher leadership, as I've mentioned. And key to all of this is the continuing support for teachers and other educators and education workers, professional development, linking that to aspirations for students and for changing needs and sustaining professional learning. So that's what we knew a year ago. And I was watching to see your responses linked to professional learning and professional development and leadership. And of course, I ask you now to reflect on how many of these things have been priority, have developed over the past 12 months, and how many have become less important because you've been dealing with the immediacy of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's move forward to this year. So what are we learning about educational leadership and developing a professionally run education system as we move through the pandemic? A pandemic that UNESCO and others forewarned could be a global crisis in teaching and learning. And I'm sure you are doing everything you can to make sure that that actually isn't the reality. I know that I'm involved in work to make sure that this doesn't become a crisis in education. Next slide. So some white water rafting from Canada for you all. So the stability around educational leadership has changed. The idea that educational change is slow and incremental has changed. What we, of course, have seen over the past 10, 11, 12 months is a rapid shift to emergency response crisis leadership by governments, understandably, necessarily, and importantly. In the best examples, there's been collaboration and co-planning by government with health experts and education professionals together. And that, where we've seen that happen, that has been important in navigating the way forward. We're seeing districts leading in the middle of a crisis, having to take government requirements and protocols, and dealing with all of the operational and logistical challenges of school closures, school reopenings, hybrid learning, remote learning. But we're also seeing in some contexts districts leading from the middle to advocate clearly for the priority importance of education, students, staff, and communities. School leaders have been highly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, a shift to rapid decisions and actions, having to deal with changing requirements and system protocols. The idea of long-term planning has been very challenging, school improvement planning, very challenging. But alongside all of the health and safety protocols, the need to centre humanity and a duty of care for students, families, and staff. And that tension that Beatrice has spoken about, dealing with the day-to-day urgency, which of course is paramount, but there's still a need to think about those longer-term plans. Professional collaboration, networks, and distributed leadership, all of which I have said are important and powerful, have become even more important. We're seeing internationally school leaders reaching out to colleagues for support, and we're also seeing other education staff, including teachers, having to rely on colleagues for support to work our way through collectively and collaboratively this crisis. So teacher leadership has come to the fore. People are having to innovate and navigate with changing realities, schooling and remote learning, professional judgment, that sharing of practice by necessity, co-developing resources and sharing, knowledge mobilization and collegial support are essential. And while I've spoken about teachers and school leaders and district leaders and government leaders, we now are really recognizing the importance of everyone who works in the education system, because it's required everyone to be involved in this, support workers and other education staff. So when these things worked well together, they were extremely powerful, but in some systems they didn't fully work well together. So we have the positives that many of you have been talking about: collaboration, distributed leadership, trust. But there has also been some context where trust has broken down, where relationships have broken down, where we've struggled. So I ask you now to think about, next slide please, how we protect and support the education profession. Students, of course, are most important, and there are very real issues and concerns and needs for student learning and equity and well-being, but I'm going to focus on the education profession today. So in Canada, when there was a survey nationally of teachers and school leaders in the spring, when we first largely moved to remote learning, educators expressed concerns about their own mental and physical health. That survey was then repeated in October, shortly after the school reopening. And the concerning thing was deteriorating mental and physical health were being reported by educators. So we had the crisis response in the spring, but if we're now seeing deteriorating mental health, that is a concern. Internationally, we're seeing evidence about increasing workload, work intensification, and work-life balance, and that applies at all levels, including for you, I suspect. And we're seeing this ongoing need for professional learning, which in some systems has been put in place and in some hasn't, for changing forms of teaching and learning, and addressing students' inequities and attending to students' mental and emotional health. So next slide. So if we look at the international evidence, there were concerns about barely coping, but it's useful to learn that yours are saying somewhat coping. If we go to the next slide, please. And one of the concerns was when teachers were asked about their mental health, that they signaled high degrees of stress. So we need to think about this piece. Can we go to the next slide, please? Teachers have also signalled, and this was an international survey for Education International, the need for professional learning, particularly around remote learning. So as we look forward, I ask you to think about these things. If we go to the next slide, please. Think about how you can lead forward beyond the crisis to sustainable leadership, new ways to engage and support all who work in education, as well as parents and families and students. The importance of collaboration, networks, collegiality and trust, and building on your connections. And to the next slide, please. So I finish with another Charlie Maxey quote. "This is getting harder," sighed the boy. "Then every step you take is a bigger victory." And now I think we have a closing set of questions for you, for Steve and I and Beatrice to discuss.